Okay, it's live.
Great. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We are on lecture 5. I found this lecture to be especially potent. I feel Steiner's been building up to a moment, laying out some presuppositions for us, and now in this chapter, he's really giving us a sense of the inversion he is trying to effect in his sort of Goethean approach to astronomy. The key issue here for Steiner is that we need to let go of this desire to find a better model, as though the goal here would just be to replace the Copernican model with a more mathematically or scientifically adequate mechanistic picture of the cosmos. He's just making sure that we understand at this point that we're never going to be able to fit the heavens into our head, right? In other words, we're never going to be able to intellectually figure out in a mathematical way how to compute the motions of the heavens, because inevitably we run into irrational numbers. And so instead of a new model, he's trying to coax us into a different feeling for the cosmos, a different way of relating to the phenomena that would not simply be through our sense organs and our ideation, our intellect, right? And so he then in this chapter goes into his threefold picture of the human being. And I want to actually share my screen and draw a little picture to capture this. But his basic idea here is that the threefold human being and the various organ systems that establish our humanness are internalizations, or in some kind of rhythmic participation with the broader cosmos. And that if we want to understand the cosmos in its totality concretely, rather than just making pictures of it in our head, then we need to understand the way in which our full human composition, physical, etheric, astral, and spiritual, and the way that our various organ systems are in some ways in correspondence with aspects of the universe. And so let me pull up share screen. I guess I don't see the share screen option. Is that because I'm just a co-host? Oh, there it is. All right. So Steiner talks about the nervous system and the senses, the rhythmic system, right? The heart, the lungs, and the metabolic system and the limbs, and the ways in which these different systems relate us to the cosmos. And he describes this inward movement related to the nerves and senses. And then he describes a kind of outward movement related to metabolism and the limbs. I'll put just a body here without a head, and this is the head. And then in between is the rhythmic system, right, which is sort of mediating between the inward and outward movements. And so with the head and senses, we get the cosmos streaming into us, and then we go to work on this with our ideas, with our thinking. Whereas in our metabolic system and limbs, he says there's a kind of analogy between the role that ideas play in our thinking and sensory life, and the role that fertilization plays in the metabolic system. And Steiner says that it's much easier for us to bring consciousness to the relationship between our breathing and our blood flow and our thinking and sensing, it's much easier to illuminate this relationship with our consciousness. But when we try to turn our attention to the metabolism, things get hazy. As you know, Steiner often says, we sleep in our will, and so it's much more difficult for us to understand what's going on at the level of metabolism and this function of fertilization, which ties us back into the cosmos, right? Our ideation pulls us deeper into ourselves, whereas the sexual reproductive process pulls us back into the cosmos. And Steiner says there's a kind of chaos that we discover at either extreme, right? And so when we take in the motions of the heavenly bodies through our senses, there's something about the beauty of that scene that leads us to believe there must be some order at work there, right? But then when we go to work with our thinking, trying to calculate a model that might explain that order, we end up with these irrational numbers, and so kind of arrive at a kind of chaos. Similarly, and actually the inverse of this occurs when we look at the embryological process of fertilization. There's a sense in which we move from a chaotic state, an unformed state, into something that's more ordered and more amenable to a kind of geometrical, even mechanical study, right? And so, you know, the ovum itself, as it begins to divide after being fertilized into the human form, is something that seems to come out of chaos into order, right? Whereas when we look at the heavens, there seems to be an order displayed, but as we reflect on it more and more, we discover it leads to chaos. And so somehow we need to find and cultivate an organ of perception that would be something like what the ancient Indians developed through their yogic breathing techniques, which Steiner associates, you know, with this attempt to balance the rhythms of human perception with the rhythms going on in the cosmos. And so to develop a sense of spiritual perception of the cosmos as a whole. But he says we've outgrown this particular approach. We can't do what these ancient Indian practitioners did with their breathing techniques. We need to cultivate a new kind of organ of perception, and be interested to explore that with everyone. Let me stop sharing my screen here. And so I thought of a neat connection here between, you know, Steiner's claim that basically astronomy is deficient in reality, whereas embryology is deficient in concepts. And there's a way in which our sense perception and intellectual reflection upon sense perception remains too abstract and removed from the real, whereas our metabolic and will life is so immersed in the real that we don't have adequate concepts for it. And there's a interesting correlation here with Whitehead's theory of perception that I just want to share briefly. One of Whitehead's important innovations in his study of the history of philosophy, something he's very critical of, and something he introduces to try to bring philosophy back to its senses, as it were, is he distinguishes between two modes of perception. One which he calls presentational immediacy, which would be akin to what Steiner talks about just in terms of sense perception. And empiricist philosophers would describe our sense perception as giving us primarily kind of patches of color that then the mind goes to work associating. And ideas for the empiricists would just be faded impressions. But even the rationalist philosophers still construed sensory perception in this way, right? That as human beings, our most immediate sort of primordial means of accessing the external world is just through the five senses, right? That's the basic idea that all modern philosophers, rationalists or empiricists, would accept, even if the rationalists and empiricists have some differences of opinion about the role that thinking might play in ordering those sensory perceptions. But what Whitehead introduces is this other form of perception, which he calls, instead of sense perception, bodily reception, or he also calls it perception in the mode of causal efficacy. And it's that part of our experience which we barely notice because we're so focused upon our sensory experiences. We barely notice the fact that we have this deeper visceral experience, which he identifies with causality or causal efficacy. It's this reality principle that puts us in touch with the rhythms of the cosmos around us. But because these rhythms are generally much more slow in their changing, in the degree to which they change in comparison to, say, what we see with our eyes, which is the visual field's constantly changing, right? So it captures our attention. Whereas these deeper rhythms, which Whitehead's not as explicit about, but Steiner really, describes these deeper rhythms quite concretely. The lunar rhythm, for example, or the day-night cycle. Our experience is obviously deeply affected by the shift in light during the course of a 24-hour cycle. And these deeper rhythms of feeling are part of what Whitehead calls causal efficacy, and it's part of what modern philosophy and science has totally ignored in its study of the universe, and instead focused only on sense experience and developing instruments which extend that sense experience, and then, of course, developing all sorts of abstract models meant to explain that sensory experience. And so it's as if modern science and philosophy have been operating in an attempt to understand the universe as if the human being were just a head with no body. And I think what Steiner is inviting us to discover is very similar to what Whitehead was attempting to do in bringing our attention back to bodily perception of these cosmic rhythms. And if we want to understand the universe as a whole, we need to develop a new kind of science which would be attentive to these subtler rhythms, not discoverable through our outward-facing senses. So I think that's all I need to share at this point. Ashton, did you want to add anything?
Just to, I guess, give some emphasis to what's implicit in everything you've been saying, which is just the little moments where he says something about method, like on page 71 of this book, he says, in later lectures, we'll see that we have to replace the drawing of lines with something altogether different if we want to comprehend the phenomena in their totality. So, geometry, beyond geometry and mathematics. And I think, he gives emphasis to metamorphosis, the principle of metamorphosis throughout this lecture, and like connecting the human instrument to these various facets of reality as a kind of, metamorphosed expression of it. That's all I want to say.
That's a key point. Like that the human being is and the cosmos are related as like the inside and outside of a glove. Like if you were to turn a glove inside out, and that changes all the surface tensions, and so the shape would be different. But to understand that interplay between the human and the cosmic, it does require this kind of topological inversion and a new kind of imaginative perception, right, that would allow us to perceive these correspondences between our organ systems and the rhythms of the cosmos.
And to start to kind of know the world more deeply, I guess, through that.
Go ahead.
Hello, hi everybody. I have been thinking about what Steiner says about embryology, and I like the term bodily reception. Thanks, Matt, for that Whitehead terminology. I will use that. I will refer to it as bodily reception. I think it's clear. And this problem of bodily reception, Steiner focuses on embryology, but in this chapter, I I realized that maybe we today should think at what Steiner is saying more in terms of genetics, more generally, not just embryology, because the points he's trying to make is that we find the origins for our morphology in the phases that the embryo and the fetus goes through. And you have the hypothesis of the recapitulation of evolution. And but what he's saying is that he's looking for causality. And that's why the idea of bodily reception as referred to causality by Whitehead is very interesting, in my opinion, because it makes us understand maybe and transpose to our age in how this problem has evolved. That is, it's not just through embryology, and we do not hear speaking so much of embryology today as maybe it was 100 years ago, because 100 years ago embryology was exactly the focus for all understanding of the transmission of our traits, because there was no understanding of DNA yet. So through the shapes that the embryo went through, one could see our correlation between evolution and individual morphology. Of course, the DNA comes into play as something that I think we should talk about. I mean, it's the same problem. It's the causality that informs us all the time. And so it's something that informs us physically and that causes us. And this is something that maybe is more, it transcends the actual, the way the senses work, because the senses are organized in a way that has developed during evolution itself. So it's something that modulates the way we see the world all of the time. And so, since of course we are always talking about Goethean science and about the idea of epistemology and how to build a bridge between human experience and science, I have a kind of maybe outrageous proposition. Maybe this bodily reception, this causality that we inherit through embryology and through genetics is nothing else that metaphysics, because we call physics the way that the nature behaves and the study of how nature behaves. But of course, we are all the time modulated by this information that comes through the physical, and that it modulates what we see. So we should take it into account as a variable. And so you used to say to talk about metaphysics as a discourse, as something that we study or we talk about, but one could have a much more embodied idea of metaphysics as just what is meta to the physics that to your experience. So if we were talking about sensory perception and bodily reception, aren't these in the end in the same positions? We could take physics and metaphysics. I know this is maybe I hope it's clear what I mean.
I think, when sometimes me and Matt are discussing Steiner and his sort of like evolutionary cosmology, which I guess you could say features different metaphysical activities throughout its process, that we'll talk about, like in contrast to other sort of metaphysical pictures, that, and Matt, love for you to follow up on this, but that like what you're describing, Lorenzo, seems to convey like the way in which rather than just give a kind of crystalline conceptual metaphysics, Steiner's metaphysics is wrapped up with a whole kind of cosmic history. And so that's what's concrete about it. And so like it wraps up individual actions, at least once individual action can be undertaken. And so there's like, yeah, like genetics in connection with karma, things like that. Any thoughts about that, Matt, before we move on?
Well, you know, there's a way in which Steiner is learning a lot from Hegel's method in the phenomenology of spirit. And it, so that in a sense, his metaphysics is not an attempt to just explain the nature of reality as if the human being were not part of it. And it, like the explanation is independent of the explainer, right? And so instead for Steiner, metaphysics is, I almost think there's another term we could use. I've just been reading Teilhard de Chardin, and he uses this term hyperphysics, which is his attempt to
physical logics. Does Hegel speak about a physical logic?
Yeah.
Okay.
But just this idea of bringing the human being and the evolving, learning human being back into the picture, so that metaphysics becomes, there's a different metaphysics for each cultural epoch, right? And for each stage of human evolution. And so it's not a fixed truth, it's a participatory truth. And that's just a totally different approach to, understanding the nature of reality that requires more flexibility instead of this fixation on a final answer. Angus, what are you thinking?
Hi, good to see you all. What am I thinking? I'm thinking about GA 194. I can't remember the title in English. Die Sendung Michaels, Michael's mission. And why am I thinking about that? When you were doing the overview of the lecture, Matt, so there's this emphasis on the breathing process, creating a new breathing process, and if you do it's like a cursory scan in that lecture series, the word breathing is mentioned 29 times. And I think it is really interesting to connect this idea of breathing with a Michael path that Steiner talks so much about. And I want to connect that idea to another idea that you said, and I want to sort of like have a little bit of pushback there, where you said, so like ideation is just into the self. And the pushback is, if we only, as long as we see ourselves separate from nature through our thinking, that's absolutely correct, your description. But if, as in like chapter 6 of Philosophy of Freedom, when Steiner makes this apparently ridiculous statement, like the idea that the tree outside is outside me, it's not. When it is there in my thinking, it is part of me. So through like a true experience of the thinking process, we are when we realize the relationship between sense perception, intuition coming, so like this is that so like outside element, this is that fertilizing element coming in, and recognizing the connection of the two. Then we've got the heart in the middle that's uniting the two in us. And just to paint another little picture, that when you were talking about hyperphysics, and I can't remember the term that Lorenzo used in relationship to Hegel, something of logic, physics of logic, perhaps it was?
Physical logic.
Physical logic. I'm just going to throw it in there for fun's sake. The Gnostics, or the Gnostics, they would talk in terms of God, I'm not actually sure that's not the correct term, but like, how did the world come about? Well, Sophia decided to like jump out of God, so that God could manifest himself. But what is Sophia? It's like in Gnostic terms, she is the material out of which the world is made, and it is also the wisdom standing behind the world, i.e. the concepts that we are rediscovering through the intuitions that we have from this source. It's like from the depths. Yeah. So I thought that I'd chuck that into the mix there.
Yeah, thanks, Angus. I should, you invited a clarification when I talk about ideation taking us away from the world. I was speaking to the description Steiner gives of the current scientific paradigm. And, you know, there's a little part in here on page, well, in my book, 77, where, and he later mentions Genesis, but I think he's very much talking about the fall and what knowledge becomes after the fall and how it changes not only the human being, but the whole cosmos, right? Where he's talking about how our inner nature produces this picture inside that, because we have bad taste, he says, is not always in perfect correspondence with the outside. And, you know, that this is what causes us to fall victim to error or sin, right? And so there's a whole Pauline epistemology thing going on in this part of the chapter that you wouldn't really notice unless you're familiar with the way Steiner will drop in these sort of biblical allusions. But then he says the Genesis. Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's wonderful that you picked up on that, because it's this idea of the given from the philosophy of freedom. Mm-hmm. It is trying to remind us of that virginal state of mind, which then becomes open to the fertilization of cosmic thought, or Michael. Exactly. And that the important thing is that we can artificially recreate that, contrary to what Hartman argues in the philosophy of freedom. He says this is a necessity for getting concepts that are or models that are more accurate descriptions of reality.
Right. Yeah, because there's a way in which at either end, you know, where this correspondence between ideas and fertilization. Ideas permit our thinking to participate in something immortal or eternal, you might say, just as fertilization in a way is what brings us beyond our individual organism's death, right, into something immortal. And redeemed, the redemption of thinking would be somehow allowing us to connect these two sources of immortality consciously.
And then he refers that to Bikaelic breathing in this lecture series that I referenced, like right at the beginning.
Nice. I'll have to follow up on that. Very cool. Gopi, good to see you here.
Hey folks,
We've missed you
for the last few times. Yeah. And it's because I missed the last few times. I had like one quick note from each of the previous lectures. So I'll just quickly briefly put that out. Lecture 2 for me, what it was doing was it was jostling the mind a little bit so that we can at least think a little bit more non-rigidly in terms of ideas. And he slowly brings in this idea of ellipses and incommensurable numbers. And I wanted to mention a fact there that you guys may or may not know. If you look at the mathematics of what is called elliptic functions, they are very chaotic, so to speak. And because of that, because of the difficulty in calculating the area within the ellipse, or even not so much the area, the length of the elliptical curve. The length of the elliptical curve is not an easy mathematical function to handle. Because of the difficulty of that, they are used still today in cryptography. So in the most high-tech cryptography that you're using in computer science and in all the encryption that we use and things like that, you see the elliptical functions kind of weave their way into all of that. So the incommensurability is a critical part of our ways of holding a secret in terms of breaking a code or something. So you see right there that element of chaos poking in. Without that, if it is too ordered, you can just open any lock in that sense, right? The more chaotic it is, the more difficult it is. So that's where real life enters, showing how it is not something that is commensurable. And then the third one is the third lecture is, I think, mostly in a way preparing the third law in Copernicus. So and also for Kepler, and this is the equation, the equations that are thrown in there, the derivation of the inverse square law that is taken straight from Hegel. So if you guys are wondering where Steiner wrote that from, he wrote that straight from Hegel. I'll pull up the reference somewhere, but if you look at Philosophy of Nature of Hegel, that is Hegel's not dissertation. It's I don't know if it was indeed his dissertation, but basically the philosophy of nature, the Naturphilosophy that he has written, and the part which deals with the physics, where he deals with color theory, he deals with all sorts of things, in oh, I didn't know that, but yeah, in Philosophy of Nature is where he goes into that and just writes down that equation very quickly and moves on. And Steiner obviously dove a little bit more into it to realize what it is. And I have written a paper about it, which I had sent to these guys earlier on to show, how the attendant imagination of a gravitation only system fail because of this way of thinking. Newton describes what is Kepler's laws, and he directs it towards the center and kind of changes it. So there is a whole bit of work that probably it's worth kind of bringing to mind. And there's another very, very casual, almost passing by statement that's given about light from a candle and light from the sun, and how we just think of light the same way in either case. That it's if it's a candle, it's giving out light, sun giving out light, so both must be the same thing. I think that's a big one, because we have not really followed out the consequences of that. Oops, I'm echoing somewhere. Yeah, so we are not really following out the consequences. I haven't seen that idea explored anywhere in all of physics, because the regular philosophical mode, what Steiner is calling, has been plastered over the heavens with great force. It's almost like a firewall. It's very hard for you to cross that. And I've been struggling with that, because that invites a different basis for understanding light. That invites a different basis for understanding our projections of time in terms of light years and all these imaginations. It changes everything, because light is the only way in which we predominantly observe the cosmos, lights of different forms. And if they are not the way the light comes out of a candle, then boy, are we in for a complete overhaul of all of astronomy. I like how Jeff said it. Explosion in slow motion, mental explosion in slow motion. That is one of those little bombs hidden there that I don't know if people really know where that can go, but I just wanted to give a little bit of intimation. And the last point I had was he speaks about commutativity. He's like, oh, we can think of A plus B equals B plus A as far as our everyday life is concerned, but how are we really sure that actually holds everywhere? And gets you wondering about it, but doesn't take it too far. But what happens if you take that forward? In the very first case, you see that it does not hold for rotations in 3 dimensions. So if I have something that I rotate this way and then I rotate that way, it's not the same as rotating that way and then rotating this way. You can try it with your book right there in front of you. So right there, even in real life, once you get out of the linear stacking mentality and start looking at turns, it falls apart. And that change from linear to rotational, the commutativity disappearing, is one of the reasons why quantum mechanics is seen to be so enigmatic, and oh, there's this puzzling aspect and so on and so forth. Well, the puzzling is, this is one of the sources of the puzzle, because you're entering rotations as primary instead of your linear way of doing mathematics as primary. When rotation becomes primary, then you're thrown for a loop, literally. And so you don't have the automatisms of the mind to come and save you anymore. And so the commutativity is ripped out from under you, and yeah, everything is enigmatic. No, I mean, not to reduce the enigma of it, but it's something that is accessible, and all you need to do is to change perspective a little bit, and that goes very far. So anyway, these were just few of the tidbits that picked up along the way, the last few lectures, and wanted to make sure I share it with you folks. Yeah.
Thank you, Gopi. Very, very interesting. Intellectually nutritious tidbits there. Alex, go ahead.
Yes, hi, good evening, everyone. Yeah, I wanted to pick up on this theme that you talked about, that you, Matt, talked about in the introduction about the Eastern spiritual traditions, because it's a theme that's quite dear to me. And let's see, in the beginning of the lecture, there's this sentence here that I'm going to quote it, and this is from the RS Archive, the online edition. Steiner says, "Our most ardent wish must be renounced when we confront the phenomena in their totality." So I was thinking about what is this wish that we need to renounce? It seems that in the Western mind, we have a desire to, and as we have spoken, I think here, to find a sort of a law or a comprehension or a science that is universal, fixed, and describes the universe in all eternity. And it's interesting that through these lectures, Steiner brings up the inherent chaos that we discover in the world. And going back to the Eastern traditions, and especially to Buddhism, that, at least for me personally, I've been practicing and studying Buddhism for many years. Chaos and impermanence is one of those truths that Buddhists contemplate and confront about reality. So it seems to me that there's, I wanted to use the word angst, as in anxiety, that I feel we in the Western mind have a difficulty to come to terms with. When I think about these this most ardent wish that is here projected into modern science, but that I think we find in many places in our society this day. And so I think it's interesting that he then speaks about that, these ancient Eastern traditions that I don't know exactly how he said, but it's as if we have surpassed them. And they are not needed anymore. So I would say personally that maybe we don't need them in the specific way that they've been transmitted, but we still need to meet this sort of I would call it anxiety, or maybe there's a better term, or in Buddhism we would say the suffering, the dukkha, that we have a difficulty to come to terms with. So I think we still need to find ways to deal with that. And well, one way is of course through the heart, the rhythmic, the breathing, which sort of unites the thinking with the metabolic. I liked also this term that you brought into, Matt. How do you call it? The bodily reception. I mean, personally, I also have I've experienced different somatic practices, like Feldenkrais, body mind centering. I think these are also have been for me ways to awake to the processes that are alive in me below my normal waking life, and I found a wholeness there. So I wanted to bring that up, just to say that personally I do find that these practices are still relevant in our days, but they do fall short from the sophisticated way of, through thinking, going into the world and uniting with the world, through Goethean science and anthroposophy, which is a different practice, and I think very important, because it shows us ways in which we can engage with the world, and all these anthroposophical initiatives are an example of that. That would not be possible through the other traditions that I've mentioned. So so that's a bit my reaction to that question. I would just also like to, just a short other idea about this word fertilization, which seems to be used in the context of sexuality. I was thinking if anyone else thought about if it could be, because there's a bit of a hint there, if it could be used as the word reproduction is used as one of the 7 life processes. I think that would be also interesting to explore, as it would give a bit more clarity in how these functional relationships between the inner and the outer are taking part.
Thanks so much, Alex. I forget exactly how I put that point about the ancient Indian methods of yogic breathing, but I certainly think that it's a delicate issue in terms of how we phrase that. It's because it's not just a matter of, oh, we've outgrown that. There's still a lot of value in these traditions. It's more a matter of what's what's appropriate and relevant for our cultural context and physiological makeup that's quite different from what it was at that time. And there is a sort of need for not just us being in rhythm with the cosmos at the level of feeling and the rhythmic system, but also, yeah, as you were suggesting, thinking and willing and finding a way to integrate these that I imagine is something like, yeah, includes what the ancient Indian practices achieved, but also adds something else that wasn't yet developed or appropriate for that time. And so it's not an either or thing, it's a both and sort of thing. It's like, yes, we can still learn much and there's more to learn. It's a better way to put it than I may have initially. So thanks for that opportunity to clarify. Yeah.
I'd like to just add something. Thanks for sharing all of that, Alex. That was great, because I, especially at that moment when he's describing, like, if we can't comprehend like this, like, especially, I guess, breathing mediated participation in the world, and we won't be able to understand the Ptolemaic system or these cosmologies that weren't rendering things in the same way that we're used to things being rendered according to like a scientific picture. And it reminded me of like this essay, I think it's Barfield's essay on like about reincarnation, something on reincarnation or something like that, where he's describing like this need for a renewal of participation and a kind of bringing forward of what this sort of model-centric perspective has been forging. And I think what's been implicit in what Steiner's been describing of our compulsion in this epoch to construe things in mathematics and mechanics, or something that's really like self-evident and certain, that it's the way Barfield puts it was forging this capacity for a kind of accurate or the aspiration for accuracy, but in a deadened way. And so there's the way he describes it as like the sort of scientific enterprise retrieving these older ways of interfacing with the world to then bring forth this kind of spirit of accuracy into that participatory relationship with the world once again. Jeff, would you like to go next?
Hello. Yeah, I'm taking so much from today. Even Matt, as you said at the beginning, you found, what was your word? Do you find this to be a particularly poignant lecture? Maybe use another word, but this, to stay in our spirit of interdisciplinarity, I'm going to drop a breadcrumb from medical eloquence. And yeah, he has it here in this lecture and previous lectures, future lectures, kind of developing this whole polarity between astronomy and embryology, which is quite an amazing polarity to begin with, but there's a lot in here, of course. So to also frame that in another slightly different way, this polarity, this human polarity, this anthroposophical polarity between the cosmos and the earth, to bring that, for me, to bring that back home to medical eloquence. This is actually one of the primary points of genius we benefit from Dr. Hahnemann in his medicine, his concepts of diagnosis and all the rest of that. Is he's the only one to date who's identified this medical polarity between what he called the substantive power of the human being and the generative power. For our resident German students, we can use the terms Erhaltungskraft and Erzeugungskraft. Thank you to Hahnemann, we have this great polarity in medicine now. The substantive power is widely known. Naturopathy, even Western allopathic medicine, without using that word, everyone is running around, trying to deal with the substantive power. We need to detox people and give them good nutrition and make everything balanced and harmonious. And yes, we do need to do all that, but with missing that really special piece of Hahnemann's genius, the generative power, or what we're talking about in Steiner's terms, this fertilization, this kind of chaotic element that kind of comes through out of the cosmos, at large, and that we have to grapple with at that level. And actually, that was very interesting to me too, Gopi, when you were talking about the cryptography needing that elliptical function. That's a super interesting example, and that's kind of a crystallizing moment for me as well. But yeah, this polarity in Hahnemann between the substantive and the generative, as I'm saying, yeah, it gives us. I'm getting this great expansion from Steiner, from this lecture, from all of this, and really understanding this human physiology, which from a medical point of view, we can, as Steiner's saying, we have to bring, we can only understand astronomy and embryology kind of in tandem with each other. Well, we can only understand Hahnemann and medicine by bringing these two elements again together in terms of treating the substantive and treating the generative side of the human being. And this is another connection I'll make here. Maybe this will help anyone trying to follow and understand where I'm coming from here. The substantive power, and when Steiner talks about the astronomical and the arithmetical, this linear function that kind of trails off into chaos, it becomes incommensurable. We can't follow it anymore. This is kind of, we see this precisely in medicine, where people, they follow that substantive quantitative approach. They can only go so far. It's like, oh, well, you take 50 milligrams of vitamin C and do 20 sit-ups in the morning, and it all becomes quantitative, and that's okay on that side. But it leads off into this problem of incommensurability, where people hit this brick wall and they don't know the brick wall they're hitting, that they are not properly penetrating into the generative power where disease sits. Imbalance is on the substantive side, and disease proper sits on that generative side. So anyways, I'm also having a very poignant moment with this lecture, a very crystallizing moment where my interdisciplinarity is really blossoming as far as all of this goes. So I'll kind of leave it at that, but that's, to me, there's a whole new world I can expand in and all that.
Yeah, the ellipses, it's very interesting because you have the classic definition of pi, right? The ratio of the diameter, like the circumference, half the circumference to the radius, or the circumference to the diameter. If you take ellipses, for each ellipse you get a different pi. You get a different number that never ends, the same way that pi doesn't ever end. So there is actually, it's so fertile that with an ellipse, you have an infinity of pi's, as there are an infinite types of or shapes of ellipses. There are an infinite numbers of pi's that exist. And that is why it comes into cryptography. There's your source. It's like a seed for an infinite number of, irrational, transrational numbers. It's right there in the ellipse. And I think that's probably why Kepler was drawn to it. He sensed that life's there. Otherwise, just if you look at it mathematically, there is barely a difference of 0.5% between the circular description and the elliptical description in terms of astronomical accuracy. But here, there's a huge difference. It's worlds apart.
I just want to highlight something that a few of you have mentioned already, and that will continue to recur as we read through this book, that Steiner is attempting this form of interdisciplinary research that is evident in the presentation of these lectures. He's having to sort of jump around from one topic to another in a way that might initially seem fragmentary, but he's all the while trying to weave them together to show the polarities between things that seem opposite, or to weave this network of correspondences between things that wouldn't otherwise seem related. But it's like every page will have several sentences that are seemingly just asides that you can zoom in on and potentially revolutionize an entire scientific field just by the indication he's giving there. And so, as I've been reading, I'm trying not to just pass over something that's like, oh, that's curious, and keep going, but to really sit with it and unpack the bomb that he's just dropped, right? It's very easy to, I'm reading this for the third time now, and there's so much more jumping out. So it's just a comment on the nature of the presentation of this new approach to astronomy and to science generally, that we really do need to attend to every sentence, because there's so much there to be digested, to use a metabolic metaphor. Angus.
Yeah, this is actually, because we've got Gopi here, I'd like to ask him a direct question. Because I know you've looked at light as like the unit and sub and super light speeds as it's like in part of your reciprocal model there. Time dilation. Can you talk to us about how that might relate to this conversation? Because I see time dilation as a way round of denying the fact that there's super light speed that's possible. It's just that they change the rules of the game so that everything stays at it's a light speed of light or lower. But I'm quite confident you can find better words to explain what I might have in a muddled fashion in my head.
Yeah, so what happened there is you must start with the original imagination of Einstein of accompanying the speed of light. So you, by doing that, you got drawn precisely into the contemplative side of things instead of the reality. It's like you left the possibility of connecting with embryology and real realities that comes and hits us from one side, and you kind of fell in love with the picture-oriented sort of reality. And that is the kind of cardinal sin, I would say, that Einstein committed, because you are imagining something that is more fiction than real. And when you start with that imagination and build your whole theory on that imagination, everything warps accordingly. And the further you go, the more the warping. And funnily enough, instead of realizing that his theory is warping, he made warping his theory. So that is how the whole general relativity and all of that came about. It was like, oh, gravity is the warping of space-time. No, your theory is warping. It's not able to handle actual force of matter, of impact, of pressure. There is no place for pressure in your world, because you have dived into the world only of light. So that warping has its pre-shock, the aftershocks of that warping cascade through space, time more, and through force even more. So the space is the first one, time is the second one, and then actual forces, and whether it is gravity or pressure, those things get way off base with relativity. So I would say they are more fantasies, and I'll give you a clear example of time dilation, length contraction, from which you can get time dilation. Say you're measuring, there is a train going by in the train station, okay, and you're trying to measure its length. Now it's a moving train, and you go and you say you measure the start of the engine. You mark down the start of the engine, and you run all the way back, and you mark down the end of the engine, end of the train. Okay. Now the distance between these would be smaller if the train has moved in the meantime. Right? If the train has moved this way, you have marked the engine over here, and it has continued to move, and by the time you go to the the back end market's end, it will not be the real length of the train. You would have condensed the length of the train. But does that mean that the train shrunk? So that is length contraction. That is exactly length contraction. It's the delay that inevitably comes in measurement just because it's a human velocity process. There is nothing instantaneous. Everything takes a little bit of time. Even if you have to read a meter, the reading process takes some time. The meter to show you that reading takes some time. You can just abstract time out, but that doesn't remove it. So once you actually start taking into account the time which you have to for something like light, then people end up with aberrations of this nature in its measurements. So it's bottom line, it's a warping that comes because, in a way, I would say Einstein fell prey to Lucifer, the light bringer.
Thanks, Gopi.
Such a helpful explanation of length contraction and time dilation. Thanks, Gopi. I mean, there's also the one aspect of the irreality of the Einsteinian thought experiments also is the postulation of a finite or a fixed speed of light, right?
Yeah.
Which isn't
That's
real.
the anchor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, all right, we're at 10:01. We'll have to wrap up for today. If anyone, I'll make the invitation again, and anyone wants to present next week for 5 or 10 minutes to lead us in, please do email, and we'd be happy to invite you to do so. All right. Have a great week, everyone.
All right.